The air inside the archive at the border checkpoint always carried the faint, dry scent of aged paper and industrial disinfectant. For Blake, this combination was a comforting testament to order, the past preserved, the present sanitized. Every document, every artifact that passed through the checkpoint's rigorous scrutiny eventually found its way to their domain, a subterranean labyrinth of reinforced shelves and climate-controlled vaults. Blake's existence revolved around precision, cataloging, cross-referencing, ensuring that the sprawling, bureaucratic tapestry of global movement remained without a single frayed thread. Today's consignment arrived with the usual clamor of a hand truck rumbling down the access ramp, signaling the presence of the transport agent. Blake did not look up immediately. Their current task involved verifying the provenance of a 19th-century ledger detailing textile shipments, a meticulous process of comparing watermarks and script anomalies. The ledger's pages, crisp and brittle, whispered tales of forgotten commerce. Blake's fingers, nimble and precise, traced the faded ink, each entry a miniature world of data. "Another shipment for processing, archivist," the transport agent announced, their voice a low rumble. Blake noted the agent's boots scuffing the polished concrete floor, a minor infraction in the otherwise pristine environment. "Place it on the designated trolley," Blake instructed, their gaze still fixed on a particular flourish in the ledger's marginalia. "And ensure the manifest matches the seals." The agent complied, and the subtle thud of a crate settling onto the metal trolley vibrated through the floor. Blake heard the rustle of paper, the agent's rapid breathing, then the receding footsteps. Only then did Blake allow their attention to shift. The crate was standard issue, a reinforced polymer container, sealed with the official red wax of the external security detail. The manifest, clipped to its lid, listed its contents generically: miscellaneous historical fragments, Section 7 gamma clearance. Blake retrieved a utility blade from a drawer, its edge glinting under the fluorescent lights, and sliced through the seals with practiced ease. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air, revealing a layer of protective foam. Beneath the foam lay a collection of disparate items: a rusted compass, a small, chipped ceramic doll, a bundle of yellowed letters tied with twine. Blake systematically removed each item, assigning it a temporary tag before placing it into a sorting tray. Their movements were economical, each gesture purposeful. Then, their fingers brushed against something else, something nestled deeper, beneath another layer of foam that seemed to have been haphazardly inserted. It was a block. Not large, perhaps the size of a fist, fashioned from a material Blake could not immediately identify. It was dark, a matte black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its surface was smooth, cool to the touch, yet riddled with a network of shallow, intricate etchings. These were not symbols Blake recognized, nor did they resemble any known script or decorative motif. They were angular, intersecting lines that seemed to form impossible geometries, shifting subtly at the periphery of Blake's vision. When Blake focused on a specific point, the lines held firm, but a glance away and back suggested a rearrangement, a slight, almost imperceptible morphing of the patterns. A prickle of unease, sharp and unfamiliar, traced Blake's spine. Every object in the archive had a history, a classification, a place. This block had none. Blake turned it over in their palm. It had an unexpected heft, a density that belied its size. No seams, no visible points of construction. It was a single, seamless entity. Blake's brow furrowed. They retrieved a magnifying glass, the polished lens distorting the etchings, making them appear even more convoluted, like pathways that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the object, a vibration Blake felt more in the bones of their hand than heard with their ears. It was not a mechanical hum, it was something deeper, a resonance that seemed to bypass the auditory canals entirely. Section 7 Gamma Clearance, Blake murmured, rereading the manifest. That classification was typically reserved for items of unknown origin, requiring specialized analysis before full integration into the archive. But even those items usually had some discernible characteristics, some historical context, no matter how vague. This block was an anomaly beyond anomaly. Blake's internal world, usually a fortress of logic and categorization, felt a sudden, minute tremor. The block was a question without a frame, a data point that refused to be plotted. Blake held it up, tilting it under the direct light of the archive lamp. The etchings seemed to deepen, to recede into the black material, then rise again, like a breath. Blake blinked, shaking their head slightly. The lines were static now, precisely as they had been a moment ago. It had to be an optical illusion, a trick of the light, or perhaps the strain of prolonged focus. Yet, the sense of disquiet persisted. Blake placed the block on a clean, white examination pad, isolating it from the other objects. It lay there, inert and silent, yet it commanded Blake's entire attention. The faint, phantom hum persisted in their hand, a residual echo. Blake felt a determined urge to understand it, to force it into a category, to label it and file it away. The dry, clean air of the border checkpoint archive, once a reliable comfort, now felt thin, almost brittle around Blake. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but directly behind their eyes. The artifact rested on the reinforced steel table, its surface absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. It was a block of obsidian dark material, featureless save for a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation in its texture, like petrified ripples in a forgotten tide. No seams, no joins, no identifiable point of origin. Just the cool, dense presence of it. Blake had spent the last hour meticulously photographing the object from every conceivable angle, using a high-resolution macro lens. The digital display on the camera showed nothing new, just the smooth, dark mass. There were no discernible markings, no inscriptions that human eyes could readily detect. Yet, as Blake zoomed in, examining the magnified pixels, a peculiar sensation began to prickle at the edges of their awareness. The undulations seemed to shift, subtly, in the periphery of their vision, even on the static image. They set the camera aside and donned a pair of thin, archival gloves. Their fingers traced the cool, smooth surface. It felt like polished stone, yet conveyed an unnatural density. There was no warmth, no vibration, nothing to indicate any internal mechanism. Blake pressed a gloved thumb against one of the subtle ripples. For a fleeting second, the air in the small room seemed to thicken, pressing against their eardrums. Blake straightened, turning their heads slightly. The archive was silent, save for the distant, muffled thrum of the checkpoint's ventilation system. They dismissed it as auditory fatigue, a byproduct of intense focus. Determined, Blake turned to the terminal, pulling up the archive's internal database. The manifest for the artifact was sparse unidentified object, recovered from Sector Gamma, Grid 7. Origin unknown. Date of acquisition, classified. A dead end. Blake widened the search parameters, entering keywords unidentified artifact, anomalous material, Sector Gamma. The search returned a deluge of irrelevant data, routine border seizures, abandoned industrial components, geological surveys. Then, buried deep within a subfolder labeled Historical Incidents, Unresolved, Blake found a reference. Not to the artifact itself, but to a series of disappearances from the same sector Gamma, dating back nearly a century. The reports were fragmented, often ending abruptly. A patrol unit vanished without a trace. A lone prospector, his camp found intact but empty. They cross-referenced the dates of these disappearances with the acquisition date of other unidentified objects logged in the system. There were only a handful, all similarly lacking detail, all from Sector Gamma. None matched the artifact Blake now examined, but a pattern began to emerge. Each time an unidentified object was logged from that sector, a spike in unresolved incidents followed in the subsequent weeks or months. The connections were tenuous, circumstantial, yet a profound sense of unease settled over Blake. The hum of the lights grew louder, a high-pitched whine that seemed to bore directly into their skull. They rubbed their temples, the gloves rustling softly. They considered calling the supervisor, the one who had assigned them this artifact, to discuss these disturbing coincidences. But what would they say? "I think this rock is causing people to vanish, and it's making me hear things?" The thought alone made Blake hesitate, a prickle of shame and self-doubt blooming in their chest. They would be laughed out of the checkpoint, dismissed as overwrought, possibly even relieved of their duties. No. They needed more. Tangible evidence. They returned to the artifact, the air around it seeming to shimmer now, like heat rising from asphalt. Blake leaned closer, their eyes scanning the surface again. The undulations were no longer subtle. They seemed to ripple, almost fluidly, under the harsh light. It wasn't a language Blake recognized, but the sound conveyed an impression of immense age, of something vast and indifferent. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled back into their steady, buzzing glow. Blake blinked, shaking their head sharply. Their hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the steel table. This was not fatigue. This was not imagination. The archive, a bastion of order and documented reality, felt profoundly wrong. Perhaps it began with the mind. They had to understand. Even if it meant unraveling themselves in the process. Blake's fingers traced the flickering text on the console, the fluorescent hum of the archival facility a constant, low thrum against their ears. Each object, catalogued with only a generic identifier, or a shared point of entry. They scrolled further, eyes scanning the entries. The data was sparse, almost deliberately so, but the common thread was undeniable. Every single unidentified object acquired within a 5-year window, coinciding precisely with the initial, subtle shifts Blake had now retroactively identified in their own perception, had passed through the same processing facility. A facility designated in the logs with a single, stark identifier, border checkpoint. A cold knot tightened in Blake's stomach. This wasn't just a coincidence of dates, it was a physical nexus. The implications were chilling, a direct link between the artifact they now guarded and a series of inexplicable vanishings, all funneled through one specific, bureaucratic node. They needed to see this place. The sky, usually a uniform gray, seemed to ripple at the edges of their vision, the asphalt ahead appearing to stretch and contract like a living membrane. Blake gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, forcing themselves to focus. It was fatigue, they rationalized, the relentless hours spent hunched over data streams. But a part of them knew better. The world was beginning to fray. Blake arrived as twilight bled into the landscape, painting the utilitarian structures in bruised purples and sickly greens. The border checkpoint was less a bustling hub and more a sprawling, desolate complex of corrugated metal and faded concrete, fenced by rusted chain link. Wind whipped through the gaps, carrying the faint, metallic tang of ozone and something else, something indescribably wrong, like static electricity mixed with the scent of decay. No personnel were visible, only the skeletal remains of what might have once been a guard booth, its windows long shattered. As Blake stepped out of their vehicle, a profound silence descended, muffling the distant drone of the highway. The ground beneath their feet felt subtly wrong, less solid, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Blake walked towards the main building, a low-slung warehouse with peeling paint, its loading bay doors gaping like a maw. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with dust and the lingering scent of something metallic and acrid. Moonlight streamed through grimy skylights, illuminating motes dancing in the stagnant air. Blake's gaze was drawn to the conveyor belt, its surface scarred and stained. It started low, a subaudible thrum that resonated in Blake's bones, then slowly, agonizingly, it increased in pitch. Blake's breath hitched. Their mind screamed for an explanation, for a trick of light or sound, but their senses were overwhelmed by the tangible wrongness. Then, it began. The corrugated metal walls of the warehouse rippled. Not a reflection, but an actual distortion, as if the very fabric of the building was losing cohesion. A section of the wall near the conveyor belt shimmered, the metal appearing to flow like liquid, the rust-colored paint dissolving into streaks of impossible color, hues that had no place in the visible spectrum. Blake stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping their throat. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that vibrated through their skull, threatening to split it open. Blake's vision flickered, the warehouse interior dissolving into a kaleidoscope of shifting geometric patterns, then snapping back into a semblance of reality, only to distort again. The concrete floor beneath their boots softened, giving way slightly, like quicksand. Through the chaos, a shape began to manifest near the conveyor belt. It wasn't forming, it was unfolding. A structure of angles and planes that defied Euclidean geometry, it pulsed with the impossible colors that had bled from the wall. It was immense, yet seemed to occupy no fixed space, its edges blurring into the surrounding air. Blake felt their mind recoil, trying to impose logic onto the impossible, but there was none. It was a visual representation of the unweaving, a tear in the canvas of existence itself. A voice, not heard but felt in the deepest chambers of their mind, resonated through the unholy cacophony. It was not words, but a concept, a profound, terrifying understanding that bypassed language entirely. It is not unweaving reality, Blake. It is simply revealing what lies beneath. The artifact, still in Blake's bag, suddenly felt impossibly heavy, vibrating with the same impossible energies that now filled the warehouse. It was not merely an object, it was a lens, a key, a conduit. The unidentified objects logged in the system, the disappearances, the subtle shifts in their own reality, all were echoes, ripples emanating from this true nature. The cosmic horror was not an invasion, it was an inherent layer of existence, always present, merely obscured. And now, through the artifact, Blake was seeing it for the first time, raw and unfiltered. The manifestation pulsed, growing, the warehouse around it groaning as its very structure began to warp and twist. Blake was no longer just an observer, they were immersed. The floor beneath their feet dissolved completely, replaced by the same shifting, impossible geometries. The metallic tang of the recycled air at the border checkpoint seemed to scratch at Blake's throat, a phantom residue of the warehouse's oppressive atmosphere. Each step on the polished concrete floor echoed too loudly, reverberating not just in their ears but within the very bones of their skull. The artifact, nestled deep within their worn canvas messenger bag, hummed a low, persistent thrum against their hip, a vibration that had long since ceased to be merely physical. It was a frequency, a wavelength, tuning Blake into something profoundly wrong with the world. They joined the short line, the queue of faces a blur of indistinct features, their expressions muted, almost uniform. Blake clutched the bag, the weight of the object within a heavy anchor, yet simultaneously a buoyant force threatening to lift them from their own skin. The unidentified objects from the archives, the catalogued anomalies, now seemed less like isolated incidents and more like footnotes in a vast, unwritten history. A history that was now unfolding around them, through them. A fluorescent light flickered above, casting a brief, stark shadow that momentarily elongated the features of the border agent at the first booth. The agent's face, etched with a practiced neutrality, seemed to stretch, ripple, then snap back into place. Blake blinked, the image momentarily searing behind their eyelids. It was not merely an optical trick, it was a shift in the fabric, a subtle tear in the curtain of perception. Next, the agent's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Blake stepped forward, their passport feeling impossibly thin, a flimsy shield against an encroaching tide. They presented it, their hand trembling only slightly. The agent took it, their fingers brushing Blake's. The agent's eyes, a dull, unremarkable brown, seemed to hold depths Blake had never noticed before, swirling with ancient, indifferent currents. Purpose of travel, the agent asked, their gaze fixed on the passport's photo. Blake swallowed, their throat dry. Research, they managed, the word tasting like ash. It was a lie, or rather, an insufficient truth. The research had consumed them, now, they were the subject. The agent's gaze lifted from the passport, meeting Blake's. The dull brown eyes seemed to deepen, to expand, reflecting not Blake's image, but a distorted, shifting landscape of geometric impossibilities. Blake saw towering structures that defied gravity, swirling nebulae of color that were not light. Pure, raw thought. Faces, countless, silent faces, all twisted in a perpetual, soundless scream. Anything to declare, the agent continued, their voice now laced with an unsettling undertone, a resonance that vibrated with the artifact in Blake's bag. Blake's grip tightened on the canvas. The artifact was no longer merely vibrating, it was singing, a low, guttural harmony that only Blake could perceive, filling the space between them and the agent. The air shimmered, the clean lines of the booth wavering like reflections on disturbed water. Everything was to be declared. Everything was laid bare. The agent knew. They all knew. The agent's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, a slight upward twitch that revealed too many teeth, too sharp, too white. "Your bag, please," they instructed, their voice a low murmur that seemed to peel away layers of Blake's own identity. This was the event. The demand, the simple request, felt like an act of profound violation. Blake hesitated, their mind reeling. The artifact pulsed with a frantic rhythm, a frantic beat that mirrored their own accelerated heart. To surrender it was to surrender everything. To refuse was to confirm everything the agent already knew, everything the world was becoming. "It's just personal effects," Blake stammered, their voice thin, a fragile thread snapping in the vastness that had opened around them. The agent leaned forward, their face no longer just stretching, but melting, reforming into something that was both human and utterly alien. Unlike anything Blake had ever known, seeped into their very core. The agent was not an individual, they were a conduit, a manifestation of the shifts Blake had been observing, a mouthpiece for the horror that had always lurked. This was the reveal. The artifact was not just a key, it was a fragment of a consciousness, a sliver of something vast and incomprehensible that had been patiently waiting, observing. And Blake, by finding it, by holding it, had become part of its awakening. The lines of their identity, their very self, blurred into the geometric impossibilities reflected in the agent's eyes. Blake's hand reached for the bag, not to surrender it, but to clutch it tighter, to feel the impossible weight, the impossible vibration, as if it were the last tether to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. The border checkpoint, the fluorescent lights, the indistinct figures in line, they all wavered, becoming translucent, ephemeral. Blake was no longer merely standing at a checkpoint, they were at the threshold of something far grander, far more terrifying. The horror was not outside them, waiting to be discovered, it was within them, now fully awake, fully aware, and pulling them into its infinite, maddening embrace. Blake was determined, yes, but their determination was no longer to find answers, but to simply be, to exist for one more moment before the final, complete absorption. The desolate stretch of asphalt leading to the border checkpoint shimmered with an unnatural heat, despite the chill in the air. Blake gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the determination a cold, hard knot in their stomach. The world outside the vehicle's windows seemed to breathe, the distant, craggy peaks of the mountains shifting imperceptibly, their contours blurring like smudged charcoal. This wasn't just a journey, it was an ingress, a deliberate step into the maw of what they had only glimpsed. The checkpoint itself was a brutalist structure of reinforced concrete and scratched plexiglass, a stark barrier against a landscape that refused to be contained. Barbed wire, rusted brown, sagged between steel posts, defying any logical pattern of defense. There were no other vehicles, no other travelers. Blake eased the vehicle to a halt, the engine cutting out with a soft cough that seemed deafening in the stillness. A figure emerged from the booth, moving with a fluid, almost too smooth gait. It was the agent, or a form of the agent Blake had last encountered. This manifestation wore a uniform that was vaguely official, its fabric a charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the light, but its details were indistinct, the epaulets and insignia dissolving into the weave upon closer inspection. The agent's face was an exercise in bland anonymity, a collection of features that refused to coalesce into a memorable identity. Yet, in their eyes, Blake saw a depth that was not human, a swirling vortex of the shifts they had so desperately tried to catalog. Identification, the agent's voice was flat, devoid of inflection, yet it resonated in Blake's chest, a low hum that vibrated through bone. It was not a question, but a command, an expectation that had already been met before it was uttered. Blake reached for the worn leather wallet in their jacket, fingers fumbling. The plastic of their identification card felt strangely malleable, its edges softening under their touch. They presented it, watching as the agent's gaze fell upon the laminated image. There was no scanner, no official device, just the unwavering stare. As the agent looked, Blake felt a profound disjunction. It wasn't just their identity being scrutinized, it was their very being. The image on the card seemed to ripple, their own face momentarily replaced by a fleeting succession of others, strangers, forgotten ancestors, faces that had never existed. The agent's eyes held Blake's, and in that moment, the border checkpoint ceased to be a physical location. It became a threshold, a membrane between what was understood as reality and the truth that lay beneath. "You have seen the patterns," the agent said, the words not truly spoken, but impressed directly onto Blake's consciousness, bypassing the ears entirely. "You have catalogued the aberrations." It was the realization that their search had not been for an external entity, but for a fundamental aspect of existence. The shifts weren't intrusions, they were the natural state, the true fabric of everything. The artifact, the documents, the observations, they were merely a Rosetta Stone for a language Blake was now fluent in, a language of constant, fluid alteration. The fluorescent light above flickered, then resolved into a constellation of impossible stars, each pinprick of light a distant, unknowable sun. Blake felt their own body responding, the distinct sensation of skin, muscle, and bone becoming less fixed, more like clay under an unseen sculptor's hand. "The border is an illusion," the agent continued, their form beginning to distend, the uniform stretching and reforming into something less human, more elemental. "There is no here and there. Only the constant dissolution and reformation. You are ready to perceive." Blake understood. The horror wasn't something that lurked beyond comprehension, it was comprehension itself, stripped of its comforting illusions of permanence. The cosmic entity was not a being, but the process, the ceaseless, silent reweaving of reality at every moment, the very breath of existence. Blake had not found it, they had become aware of its ubiquitous nature. And in that awareness, their individuality, their perception of self, began to fray. Their determination had led them to this precipice, and now, they were falling in. Their memories, their hopes, their fears, they weren't disappearing, but rather, they were becoming untethered, dissolving into a vast, oceanic consciousness that encompassed all time and all possibility. The border checkpoint, the vehicle, the agent, even the concept of Blake itself, began to fold in on itself, like a paper diagram collapsing into a single, infinitely dense point. It wasn't a gesture of comfort or malice, but of absorption. Blake felt their own hand reaching out, not of their own volition, but as if drawn by an irresistible current. Flesh met something that was not flesh, but a confluence of raw existence. There was no pain, only emerging, a profound, undeniable integration. The last thing Blake perceived was not a vision. A knowing, the border checkpoint, now indistinguishable from the swirling chaos of the universe, would continue its silent operation, a forgotten gate for those rare, unsuspecting souls whose perceptions might, for a fleeting moment, align with the true, terrifying rhythm of reality. The shifts would continue, unnoticed by the vast majority, an insidious, eternal hum beneath the thin veneer of order. And a new awareness, a new fragment, would join the silent chorus, forever observing the unraveling.